Hi, everyone. Hello. I see some familiar faces. Hi.
Hello.
uh,
Hey,
okay.
Marty.
Hello, hello. My name is Madi Irizarry, and I am the Creative Services Director at Three Village Historical Society. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. In just a few minutes, you'll be hearing from our good friend, Tara Ryder, as she presents Journey of Hope, the Irish in New York. Tara is the director of Stony Brook University's international academic programs to both Ireland and England, seeking to introduce students to new cultures, ideas, and history. This is Tara's fourth time lecturing for the Society, but it's her first doing it virtually with us. And I know that you're all in for a treat. Before we get started with Tara, I'd like to quickly let you all know about our new holiday market beginning Saturday, November 28th, and every Saturday after that until Christmas. We'll be hosting an outdoor holiday market on the grounds of the Society and Gallery North. It'll run from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., and it's a safe way to shop local this season. You can find more info about the holiday market on our website at tvhs.org. Okay, one last thing before we get started. When you joined our Zoom meeting, your mic was automatically put on mute. We ask that you please leave it that way throughout the entirety of the presentation. Tonight's lecture will run about 40 minutes or so, and we'll finish off with a brief question and answer period. Feel free to type your questions in the chat feature that you'll find on the side of your screen or at the bottom of your screen. And Tara will get to your questions, hopefully all of them, after she's done with the lecture. Okay, I think that is about it, and we're gonna turn it over to Tara. Tara.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this will all work nice and smoothly. Let's see. Okay, is the screen sharing to where everyone can see it? Okay, perfect.
You're good.
Always like those technological miracles. Well, welcome. We're going to talk about Irish immigration to New York, which is really kind of very telling of Irish immigration to the United States. I suspect many of you in the audience are Irish out there. Just so you know, I come from a very Irish background. My dad is from Belfast and my mom is from Connemara, and I've been doing Irish dancing since I was 3, so I just can't get away from being Irish. But in many ways here in the United States, that's actually not unusual. Almost 50 million Americans claim Irish descent, and there's almost as many throughout the rest of the world. And that's really amazing when you realize that today's population of Ireland is just a little over 6 million. There's about 4.25 million in the Republic and just under 2 million in Northern Ireland. And at the very height of its population, you only had 8 million people, and that was actually in the beginning of the 19th century. So this very tiny island has made an enormous impact on the world, including the United States. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Irish pubs. I know there's Tara's over in Port Jeff Station. Some of you may have eaten there. You may have seen the Broadway musical like River Dance, and of course, St. Patrick's Day. That is definitely a New York holiday. And what I want to kind of get across is that because so many people have Irish ancestry, there's been a huge interest in the history of Ireland. Even if what many people believe to be true comes more from the imagination of poets and storytellers rather than from historians and scholars. And so that's where we're going to kind of begin this talk a little bit. So many times in the past 5,000 years, this very small island, which to give you a sense of size, it fits into Texas 9 times with a little bit of extra room. But this small island has stood at the heart of European culture. In the middle of the 8th century BC, it may have been the wealthiest place in Europe. It had beautiful gold ornaments like you're seeing here that were equaled anywhere north of Egypt. And one of the things that truly makes Ireland unique was it was never absorbed into the Roman Empire. And so it has unique cultural traditions that date back potentially to the Bronze Age. And we also know that when Christianity did arrive in Ireland in the 5th century AD, there was already a very strong spiritual presence on the island. And what's really kind of unique about Ireland and Christianity is that we didn't have any major conflict with the arrival. Usually you think of, the coming of the Christians and let's throw them to the lions. In Ireland, they very much welcomed it, and we see an extraordinary convergence that created a really unique Christian church and had long-term influence. We're just getting past Halloween, which was a Celtic holiday, Samhain. And the fact is that after the fall of Rome, Ireland kept scholarship alive in Europe. And it helped to carry civilization back to the kingdoms that rose out of kind of the ruins of that period. And by about the 10th century, European kingdoms really thought that they needed to have an Irish philosopher, or a theologian to really make their courts seem powerful. But we're not going to focus on history that far back. What we're going to really take a look is at the reason the Irish came to the United States. And they came here for a variety of reasons. So some of them came for religious persecution. Some were looking to escape economic hardship, to get a fresh start. And some came simply to escape death by starvation. And many of them left behind everything they knew: family, friends, loved ones. And when the Irish left Ireland to come here to the United States, to come here to New York, there was no big, bon voyage party. It was an incredibly traumatic moment during this time. And they actually called it an American wake. And for those of you who are familiar with Irish cultural practices, a wake is the celebration we have when someone passes. And so as far as they were concerned, going to America was like you dying. And so they bid this kind of fond farewell. But we also see that once they arrived here, and they're going to face a huge amount of prejudice and hardship, which we'll talk about, they really ended up taking America on its own terms. And here in New York, we're going to see that they dominate New York City politics. They extend helping hands to their own. They help to literally build our state. You have the Irish that are working on the Croton Aqueduct. They're working on Central Park. They're building the Brooklyn Bridge. We're going to see them building the Empire State Building. And, if we think back to more recent times, when you look at that tragic September morning in 2001, how many of those that were in the fire departments and police departments traced their ancestry back to Ireland? And so we do recognize that the Irish helped to give New York our fighting spirit, our New York attitude, and our love of America. And it's interesting because when New Yorkers speak, and I will admit, I'm not a New Yorker, so bear with me on that. I don't have the New York accent, but they have done studies that the speech patterns that make the New York accent so very recognizable around the world are actually patterns coming from Irish immigrants. They help to shape our pronunciations. And so what I want us to think about is how Irish immigrants and their descendants have, really shaped New York's spirit and our voice. And we can learn about this through Irish and Irish American culture, which is so often celebrated in verse and song. And so you're going to see throughout this talk, we're going to look at a lot of the songs and poetry from that period. And I always like starting out with a quote that Brendan Keneally said. He said, "All songs are living ghosts that long for a living voice." And so tonight, I'm hoping we can give voice to our past, in which the Irish came over and helped to shape our, great state here. So when we think about the Irish, there's a couple of waves of immigration. And so the first major wave of immigration really happened right as, New York colony was being settled. So you had mainly young, poor Catholic men who traveled from Ireland. They took an 8 to 10 week voyage on their way over to this kind of early English settlement. And they, worked on other people's property because most of them did not have enough money to buy property. But one thing that we see that is kind of consistent is a longing for the country they left behind. They may have left it because they wanted better opportunities, but Ireland never seems to leave their heart. And so one of the things that we need to recognize is the very act of voluntarily setting out to find new opportunities in a foreign land runs counter to the Irish roots. So in the Irish language, there's actually no word for willingly departing the homeland. So there's no word for immigrant. The word that has been used is actually deiri, which means exile. And that really says a lot that they may have been leaving because they needed to, but for them, it really was an exile that was happening. And we're going to see that by the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s, the British in Ireland were attempting to obliterate the Irish way of life. It was an attempt to subjugate what was considered the barbarous Irish. And so they make it illegal to play a lot of the traditional instruments like the harps and the pipes. And the English were particularly fearful of songs that hinted at social protest, because we're going to see that the Irish put a lot of their thoughts into music. And in this period of the late 17th, early 18th century, we're going to see over 100,000 Irish leaving for America due to growing poverty and social unrest. And most of them were single Irish Catholic men that were in their late teens, early 20s. And so they left behind, a lack of opportunities, and they came feeling very, very optimistic. And this is a song that kind of captures that mood. Farewell to old Ireland, the land of my childhood. And so they're saying, that's our past, but they're coming to, New York and to the America in search of fame, fortune, and sweet liberty. Now, this wasn't an easy journey. The cost of crossing the Atlantic was equal to about 6 months worth of pay. And it was not a pleasant crossing. You had damp, insect-infested ships, food was scarce, you had diseases like cholera and dysentery running rampant. And even once they arrived, there was no certainty. Many of them came over by themselves. They didn't have connections. They faced massive prejudice against the Catholics. And you will see that most of these young Irish men give up their Catholic religion. It's more important for them to find the job than to keep those ties to Catholicism. But we're going to see changes happening as we get into the beginning to the middle of the 18th century. And this is the arrival of what's known as the Scotch Irish. And these were settlers. So in this period of the Tudors going into the Stuarts, they attempted to make Ireland Protestant by taking Protestant Scots and transplanting them to mainly Northern Ireland. And the idea was that you would plant Protestantism. It didn't really work as well as they planned. First of all, they weren't Church of England, they were Presbyterian, so they were still kind of second-class Protestants as far as the English were concerned. And many of them faced all kinds of economic issues. And so many of these Scots-Irish are going to leave Ireland and come in through New York. Many of them go into Western New York, going into Pennsylvania, and down through the Appalachian Mountains. And they really kind of left some really poignant songs with us. One of the songs that they have is, I left Ireland and mother because we were poor. They're very blunt in what they're saying. I'll never forget on that bright rosy morn, when old Ireland I left, how my poor heart did mourn. When my blessed old mother said, be of good cheer, goodbye, Michael darling, farewell, mother dear. Then my brothers and sisters took me by the hand and bade me do right when I left Ireland. Then I bade them goodbye at our cottage door. I left Ireland and mother because we were poor. The whole idea was that by crossing the Atlantic, they would gain levels of freedom they did not have in Ireland, and they could gain economic stability. And that's going to be really critical for this group. And we're going to see that they will go and they will claim land and really put down strong roots. And one of the most widely sung songs of immigration from Ireland to America came out of this group. It's known as the Green Fields of America. And besides being a literal description, it does suggest the metaphor of the opportunities that America was going to provide for these Irish immigrants that were facing economic depression. So that first wave is either Protestants or Catholics that basically just put their faith aside. It's the second wave of immigration that probably most people are familiar with. And that is the second wave that comes over because of the Irish potato famine. So between 1845 and 1851, you have a potato blight that strikes Ireland 5 of those 6 years. And it has devastating consequences to the population. We know that at least 1.5 million men, women, and children died when the potato crop, which was their primary food source, was wiped out. Another million left for America and Canada and England and Australia. Most of them end up coming to America. And some of them left directly from Irish seaports. They took what became known as coffin ships, because these were really old ships that were, had poor water, that were not prepared to take immigrants across. And so this was an awful experience. And those who arrived safely worked in order to send money home to bring their family over. Now, a little bit about the background of the famine. So when it struck in the middle of the 19th century, this was the point when Ireland's population was at its highest. It was around 8 million people. Most of them were Catholic, poverty-stricken, and they were crowded onto very small land holdings. And due to a disturbing combination of indifference, incompetence, prejudice, and greed, these victims of the famine did not receive the assistance that was so needed. And what was so sad was that you had livestock and grain being shipped daily to England while people were starving and actually watching this food leave their country. And so this is a period known as the Great Hunger, or Unguntamore, the Great Irish Starvation. And it shapes so much of not only Irish history, but of Irish immigration history. This is part of what's known as the Irish diaspora. Many of those who were forced to leave Ireland and who also died came from the Gaelic-speaking areas. And so it had devastating consequences when it came to language and culture. Fewer than 80,000 people today speak Irish. Today, the silence about the famine is over, but the search for one's ancestors still often ends with the very stark realization that you may never know what happened. It's only through memories and verse and song that the story of so many of those people live on. Now, as I said, you have a mass wave of Catholic immigration that's going to come from Ireland and come to the United States, with the majority of them actually coming through the New York area. New York and Boston were the two main ports. And from the period of the famine to the next 75 years, we have 5 million people leaving Ireland, coming to the United States. And you could imagine this is hope. This is leaving behind famine, leaving behind starvation and disease, and they're looking to find a job when they see a sign like this. And so some of you are probably familiar with the idea of no Irish need apply. And we have to recognize that they faced absolutely devastating issues of prejudice in this time period. You will see ads, and here's 2 good examples that do specifically say no Irish need apply. Now, there is an interesting element to this. So I'm just going to back up a slide. This is, as I said, kind of one of the famous images, no Irish need apply, and this idea of the signs. And while there was definitely prejudice, and you will find the advertisements listing it, most of the signs that you're going to find in stores that date back to this period, if you go to like an antique market, flip them over. On the back, most of them say made in London. So one of the things to recognize is that the prejudice was there, not necessarily the signage. New York City is incredibly well documented thanks to photography, and we don't actually see these signs in the windows, but the prejudice was there, and we do see it in the advertisements. Now, when they arrived here, we do have to recognize they were poor, they were uneducated, they were unskilled, and many of them were hoping to simply send wages back home to help their family come over, because this was where the roads were supposed to be paved in gold. Now, we're going to see that about 60% of all Irish immigrants make their home in New York City specifically. And they basically start creating what becomes known as shanty towns or patty towns. These were areas that were all Irish neighborhoods. They were often described as lace curtain Irish, because they'd have the lace curtains in the window. I don't know for any of you who are Irish, I know I'm guilty. I have my lace curtains in my windows right now. And these neighborhoods, though, were very, very damp, noisy. They were overcrowded. Typically, they were right on the water. So a good example of this is 5 Points in New York City. And so, these were places where, because of the crowds and the dirt, you had issues with disease running rampant. And Irish infant mortality was the highest of any group in the United States. And you can kind of see through these images why, especially when you recognize that so many of the immigrants, when they arrived here, were not healthy to begin with. And then because they lack skills and they're illiterate, they're going to end up, the men are going to end up as unskilled laborers, miners, ditch diggers, dock workers. So they never necessarily had steady work. And they often had pretty dangerous conditions. And on average, male famine survivors who emigrated to the United States lived less than 10 years after arriving here. They died of typhus, cholera, TB, as well as the issues associated with alcohol. Now, ladies, we have a slight advantage over them. So we typically would have worked as servants or cooks. And often the Irish female immigrants actually earned a slightly better wage than the men. And so the larger picture here is actually a picture from Castle Garden, which was an area in the city where you could go to, potentially meet someone who was looking for a job. Now, Irish female immigrants had to deal with a different issue. With the famine, they did not necessarily come over in family groups. They came over as young, single females. And so they had kind of a different type of issue that they had to deal with prejudice, and also with, not having the quote unquote male protector to keep them safe from, say, the master of the house who might be feeling a little frisky. We do see that by 1855, the Irish comprise 87% of New York's unskilled labor force, but they start to build strong communities. And we actually see that with the creation of organizations like the AOH, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which actually dates back to 1836. And they were there to help their Irish neighbors keep their spirits up, but also to have a, camaraderie. And we'll see from the 1820s to the 1860s, the Irish are the leading immigrant group to the United States. And by 1860, out of New York City's 800,000 residents, a quarter of them were Irish born. So this really starts to explain that Irish accent influencing the New York accent. And the Irish become America's first urban underclass. Now, we do have to recognize that many Americans very much accepted the image of the Irish as irresponsible, flawed individuals. And this was a stereotype that's part of that cultural baggage that came over from England, and that we see actually throughout the rest of Europe. And this is a great image kind of showing, Florence Nightingale, she's beautiful and, demure, and then you have Bridget McBruiser next to her. Many Americans, like the British, believed that Irish poverty was a sign of laziness, of immorality, ignorance, and superstition. And these become traits that are inseparable from Irishness and Catholicism, because the Irish are the first mass Catholic immigrant group coming over. And we are going to see that there is definitely, from the middle of the 19th century, a lot of violence against the Irish. It actually leads to the creation of what's known as the Know Nothing Party. So as I said, there was this assumption that the Irish and or Catholic was a moral failing, a sign of laziness. And in the middle of the 19th century, there's a Protestant evangelical revival that's known as the No Popery movement. And if you went to the Protestant Sunday schools as a child, one of the games you might have played was Break the Pope's Neck. So these are very clearly kind of being insinuated into society during this time. And so there's a very strong stereotype that is created. And you can even see, this is an image from Thomas Nast, who was a popular illustrator of the time and who was very anti-Catholic. And if you look closely, you can kind of see that the Irish are being given more animalistic features. Now, the American Republic Party, which will become known as the Know Nothings, was a nativist organization that was staunchly anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. They wanted to deny the vote to the Irish. They wanted limits placed on immigration. They wanted a 20-year wait before an immigrant could become a citizen and be able to vote. So if you remember, most men didn't survive more than 10 years. This would keep the Irish from voting during this time period. And it was definitely very clearly recognized, but the Irish did not take things quietly. They often protested in song, like this one that you see here. And not only did they protest in song, it is in this period that we start to see the rise of the separate Catholic parochial school system. And it is an attempt to, keep the Catholic faith alive. And again, it leads to some of the tension between Catholics and Protestants in the 19th century. But we are going to see that the parochial schools helped the Irish to carve a foothold into American society. And even as many cities in the United States start to face this violence, you have convents being looted in Chicago. You have a church, set on fire in St. Louis. You are going to see a pushback from New York Irish Catholics. And this is an image of Archbishop Hughes, who had appealed to the mayor of New York for protection of the city's churches. And when the mayor asked him if he was worried, Hughes said to him, "No, mayor, it is you who should be worried about yours. Should one Catholic come to harm, or should one Catholic business be molested, we shall turn the city into a second Moscow." Moscow had burned during the Napoleonic Wars, and that's what he's referencing there. And we are going to see that Irish Catholics, including organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians, stood guard at various Catholic schools and convents and churches throughout New York. And here in the New York City area, not a single church was set on fire. And for such a large city, that really was very, very different. Which brings us to the Civil War. And in the Civil War, we see America, that had been the land of promise for the Irish, becoming the land of great sacrifice. Thousands of young Irishmen gave up their lives on the battlefield here during that period. And the estimate is that about 200,000 Irish immigrants and their descendants fought in the American Civil War, most of them on the side of the Union, but not all. And we do recognize that by the time the Civil War starts in 1861, the Irish were slowly starting to gain a foothold in American society. They were slowly starting to pull themselves up, thanks to kind of this camaraderie and this ability to create the schools. However, their loyalty was still in question. The question of, could you be Catholic and American? The idea of the Pope versus the president. And so when the Civil War started, many Irishmen enlisted in large numbers. And some of them, it was to prove their loyalty. Some of them because they were drafted. Some of them because they wanted to gain military experience to take home to Ireland. And it's actually interesting, the Union Army had a recruiting station in Dublin. And they basically said, we will pay your way from Ireland to New York if you would join the Union Army for the length of the war. And then they would also give them a bonus, which was basically the equivalent of 5 years of wages in Ireland. And so again, a lot of Irishmen saw this as a way to gain necessary experience so they could then go home and fight a war of independence in Ireland. And we see this kind of taking place during this time. And many of the Irish start to become well known. So their gallantry and bravery started to change public thinking. And some of you may be familiar with the Fighting 69th, which today is still a very strongly Irish-American Army unit that today is currently in Afghanistan. And they fought in every major battle of the Civil War. And people started going, okay, you can be Irish and you can be a loyal American. Unfortunately, that changed in 1 week in July of 1863. In July of 1863, you have the draft riots. Basically, by 1863, the war is dragging on. It's no longer nearly as popular as it once was in New York. It's hitting New York quite economically hard. And there was a lot of animosity between the Irish and the African Americans in the New York area because they were both at the very bottom of the socioeconomic scale. And the Irish felt that African Americans were not being asked to do enough in this war. When you were drafted, you could serve, if you were drafted, you could serve. If you had money, you could have someone pay your way. And the thing to keep in mind, though, was that as long as someone served, it was considered honorable. The Irish had a lot of issues with African Americans because they could not be drafted. And they felt that they should be fighting this war since it was a war of slavery. And in July of 1863, New York had to have a draft, and they had 1,200 names. And many of the Irish felt that there were too many O's and Micks on that list, that it was mainly the Irish who were being called up to fight. And they basically rioted for a week. The estimate is that more than 20,000 New York Irish were involved. They did an enormous amount of damage. We don't actually know how many people died because of the riots, because many people were kind of buried. They were attempting to protect themselves. We actually see a mass fleeing of African Americans out of the New York City area during this time. But it was so severe that the Union Navy bombed New York City. So if you go walking through 5 Points, I encourage you to take one of their walking tours. You can look up and you can still see one of the Union Civil War cannonballs in the building. And so think about what it means that the Union is bombing its own side. They did what today we estimate is about $5 million worth of damage to the city. And that definitely kind of made people rethink what the Irish were doing, that where they'd started to kind of pull themselves up, this kind of wiped a lot of their goodwill out. But we're going to see that the Irish do not give up. It is throughout the 19th and early 20th century that we see them getting involved in politics. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed himself was not Irish, but many of the men who worked for him and who took over from him were. And one of his Irish henchmen admitted that American urban politics was a filthy pool of shabbiness, falsehood, and corruption. And many complained that the Irish were conquering their cities through this political patronage. And the Irish recognized the corruption, but they saw it as an opportunity to get a leg up and to get involved. And many of them do not take their rights for granted. Patrick Dunny, who was an Irish immigrant that came over in the 1870s, wrote a letter home saying, "I am an American citizen and I had the honor of voting in the last 2 elections." They definitely used their political voice. Again, they're going to continue to support the fight for freedom from Great Britain back in Ireland. So you have this kind of nationalistic, or what's known as the Fenian movement. And there's a lot of songs about the relationship between the Irish in Ireland and then the Irish immigrants and their descendants over here. You get the founding of the Irish Republican Brotherhood that's in both Dublin and New York in 1857. And so the Irish here do not forget their roots. It's actually interesting, between 1867 and 1870, Irish immigrants attempted to conquer Canada in order to hold it hostage to get Ireland free. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone taught them geography, so they had no idea how big Canada was. So we do have to recognize it was unsuccessful, but give the Irish credit, we did it 3 times. We were not going to give up on this. And you definitely see that continuing. In World War I, when the US enters on the side of Great Britain, you are going to have many of the Irish joining the American forces, but it does not mean that they give up on supporting Irish freedom from Great Britain. The estimate is that over $10 million was sent back to Ireland from New York alone between 1919 and 1921 to help the Irish Republican Army fight and win the war for independence, which does occur in 1921. And one immigrant proudly declared that Irish immigrants had proven themselves 100% American and kept the faith for dear old Ireland, that you could have both the United States and Ireland in your heart. Now, we will see that as we get into the beginning of the 20th century, the Irish are really going to start to identify more with Catholicism than being Irish. Many of them leave groups like the AOH and join the Knights of Columbus. And the church definitely becomes really significant. It is literally a place to pull them together, but you also see the building of the church in a very literal sense help to build the communities. This gave jobs to so many Irish immigrants and their descendants. And in 1920 alone, more than 50,000 Irish American nuns labored without pay in the United States to teach 1.7 million students in 5,400 parochial schools. And most of those students had Irish heritage. So the church also becomes a way to build a community, but to build a social economic opportunity to climb the ladder. And we're going to see that, you know, as you get into the 1930s and 1940s, being anti-Irish starts to be, let's be blunt, uncool. Look at these, you know, faces. Many of you, I'm sure, recognize them. You know, James Cagney as Yankee Doodle Dandy, and of course you have Bing Crosby as Father O'Malley. These become popular actors whose Irish qualities of toughness and charm appealed to everyone. And so we're going to start to see the Irish slowly working their way into becoming accepted as Americans during this time period. We will see, though, that once Irish immigrants leave, whether it's in the 1600s or the 1900s, it is actually very rare for them to go back home. And I can speak to my own experiences. You know, my mom left in the late 1960s, and it wasn't until my 40th birthday that my mom went back home to Ireland. That was the greatest gift I could give her. And she wasn't unusual. That even, you know, in more recent times, crossing the Atlantic was just prohibitive when it came to costs. And Danny Boy is one of those songs that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, that speaks to this kind of experience of not returning. Now, as we get into the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, you have a Celtic revival, and it's led by writers like Joyce and Yeats, and it's the attempt to create an Irish identity. And that Irish identity is what I meant when I said so much of what we think of as being Irish was created by storytellers and poets, because they went back to pre-Christian Ireland and kind of pulled stories to create what it meant to be Irish. And it definitely influenced not only the Irish, but immigrants all over, including here in New York. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, if you go to one of the St. Patrick's Day parades, or really any of our parades, you see the pipe bands. I do have to make the comment here. Those pipes that they're playing are Scottish pipes. The Irish do have pipes, the Uilleann pipes, but they're played sitting down. So they don't really work well in parades. But we do have, I mean, think every fire department, police department has a pipe band, and that really speaks to the involvement of the Irish in shaping so much of our city life and our state's life. But it also showed how they made themselves part of the New York community. And of course, today we have Irish dancing. And Irish dancing, again, much of it comes out of this Celtic revival. And I'm sure many of you have, maybe seen Riverdance. You always know that Irish dancing has finally become mainstreamed when you get your Folgers coffee commercial having Irish dancing. But in 1994, you got Riverdance. It was a phenomenon that literally demonstrated that being Irish was simply just part of American culture, of New York culture. They broke records in their tours, and today we see, Irish dancing becoming so very common. I help run a dance school. We have 300 dancers, and only about a third of them have any Irish ancestry. The Irish became part of New York culture that everyone gets to be Irish at least one day of the year. And it is something to keep in mind of how Irish identity has really helped to shape Irish American identity, but also simply American identity. And so this was a very quick tour in which I want to say, American by birth and Irish by the grace of God. And to say thank you to everyone. I know this was, as I said, a very quick tour. I know Zoom is always harder to stay focused on. But I do want to, take time and answer any and all questions people have. And I think I actually kept it to 40 minutes, which for someone who is Irish is absolutely amazing because we talk a lot and we have no sense of time. So if anyone has questions, I would gladly try to answer them now.
Thank you so much for that, Tara. Just to let you know, you're slightly over 40 minutes, but we won't hold you to that. Close enough.
I was trying. That was a lot of how fast can I talk? So I'm sorry if that was like.
You covered a lot. So thank you for that. I just want to remind everyone the chat feature is either on the bottom or the side of your screen. It's a little chat bubble that says chat on it. You can type in your questions and I'll ask them to Tara. All right, so we have a question here, funny question from Jeff. He says, they didn't have Venmo back then. How did they send money to their families?
Actually, a really great question, because what do we do without Venmo today?
Right.
Sometimes they were literally sending hard currency. There was some systems, and we do have to recognize the systems of banking sailors had been using for a couple hundred years. So some of those systems were already in place. I know, and again, I don't have all of the answer here, but I actually know from my grandmother. So my grandmother was the youngest of 18. I come from a really big family. I have 198 first cousins, to put this in proximity. I'm very Irish in that sense. But my grandmother was the youngest of 18, and she said it was always a big deal when they get an envelope because she would get to sometimes hold the money. It would be a crisp bill that she would get to hold. And that was, again, her older siblings attempting to send money home. Now, my grandmother didn't come over actually until my mom did in the 1960s. But again, many of her relatives came over, and then some stayed, some went on to other areas in the United States.
Thank you. We have a question from Tara May, another Irish Tara, and our group here. And she asks, what percentage of Irish fighting for the Union Army were in it due to practices of substitution when rich white men paying poor Irishmen to fight for them in their stead?
Okay, so that's a great question. I can't tell you the percentage. I don't know how much of that has actually been looked at. Many of them did, and they actually initially did it quite willingly, again, because they saw it as experience. And some of it was just survival. This was a way to get paid, to have, I'm not going to say 3 square meals a day, but the idea that they would have some food regularly. What the percentage was, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I haven't really looked specifically at like the Civil War, but you do have huge numbers that volunteer, but many more are also drafted.
Right. We have a question from Bev Tyler, our historian at the Society. Bev says, on a tour of Ireland, we were told by Irish musicians that many, actually most of the musicians, left Ireland, and the Irish who remained had in many cases gone back to New York and other places to recover Irish tunes and melodies. Do you have any info on this?
That's actually quite true. So part of it is a lot of what we think is really the Irish music and not what I'm going to call the English music. We're coming out of Western Ireland, out of places like Connemara, areas of the Gaeltacht, and there's 7 or 8 areas in Ireland where Irish is still spoken fluently. To live there, you have to be fluent in speaking and writing. Those areas, though, were the ones during the famine that were hardest hit. And that was why the Irish language started to die off. Technically, today, the Irish language is seen as a dying language. There's an attempt to revive it. But those Irish songs and those Irish musicians were the ones who emigrated. And so I've actually heard that quite commonly, that many of them came. And there's actually, you have the Irish House out of NYU, which Matt Maloney from the Chieftains actually was involved in. And part of what he looked at was getting some of the Irish songs that had kind of come across and bring them back to Ireland. So that is part of what we see coming out of the Irish immigration, that it was the Irish who left Ireland. Not to say that there weren't those who were what we call Anglo-Irish who also left, but so many of those of Irish, Catholic Irish, and I'm trying to make this really clear, were the ones who left and took the songs with them. Again, it had devastating consequences on all of Ireland, but Western Ireland was hit particularly hard, and that's where a lot of the Irish, what we think of as traditional Irish music, came from. A lot of the Irish language songs. So they did come, and there are attempts to revive, and I will tell you, you can get free Irish lessons here on Long Island. If you go to the Ancient Order of Hibernian Hall in Babylon, they will gladly give you Irish language lessons. We're trying to keep the language alive. And right now, the estimate is more people speak Irish outside of Ireland than inside of Ireland.
Wow. That's a good segue to the next question from Christine Orlando, asking if you're aware of any local organizations in the county.
There are lots of Irish organizations here in the county. If you're looking for Irish dancing, I can actually tell you on Wednesday nights at the Babylon Hibernian Hall, we have adult Irish dancing, no skills needed. I get to be your fabulous teacher. So I'd love for you guys to come down. So we do have Irish dancing that's available. There is lots of organizations that offer music lessons. Again, I'm affiliated with the Ancient Order of Hibernians in Babylon. So we have pipes, drums, language lessons, and dance lessons. There was, and I'm not sure, there was an Irish language program in Setauket. I have not found any reference to it in the last 2 years. But if I can find, if it's still in existence, I will send it to Mari, and maybe you can pass it out with the information. I think that it may have hit some lack of participation issues.
Okay. Jay has a question. Jay says, this is Jay from Wading River. What was the relationship between the Irish and Jewish immigrants in New York?
That's an interesting question. One thing that we have to think about is, I'm sure many of you on St. Patrick's Day eat your corned beef and cabbage, which is a New York Irish habit. That is not actually Irish. My mom would yell at me if I ever considered eating corned beef. You will find it in the pubs in Ireland now, but it's kind of one of those things. This is kind of the interesting part, how much Irish American culture has been actually exported back to Ireland. When we think about this, there was definitely, interaction, as I said, corned beef. And the reason that becomes the Irish food is it was the cheapest. It's what they had was available. And again, the Irish were at the very bottom. Other exchanges, again, especially in those early years, you have kind of tight-knit cultural communities, so there's not a lot of exchange. But as we get into the 20th century, as groups push out here onto Long Island, it is actually interesting. If you go back to like 1900, how many St. Patrick's Catholic churches there were on Long Island. And we still have several. There's one, in your local area. There's another one kind of further up in Nassau. But a lot of the St. Patrick's churches became St. Anthony's as the Italian immigrants moved out. And as we're seeing the Hispanic immigrants kind of head out, you're seeing kind of immigration and how immigration spreads on Long Island. Churches get renamed. But we do know that there is interaction out in like the Sag Harbor area between Irish communities and the Jewish community out there. But again, I can't speak too much more about that. That hasn't been something I've looked in particular at.
So for St. Patrick's Day in Ireland, you eat the colcannon, is that right?
Exactly. And I would like to say St. Patrick is probably turning over in his grave. St. Patrick is one of the really kind of interesting medieval Irish saints in the fact that he's actually our only saint from that period that we have his writings. We actually have two of his writings. We have his autobiography, and we also have a letter from him. And in that letter, he basically is telling one of the contemporary heroes of the day to stop drinking, stop whoring, and stop partying. So St. Patrick's Day is not what he would expect. And it really is, again, a New York American Irish holiday that we exported back. Dublin did not have their first St. Patrick's Day parade until 1994. And it is still very much a holy day over there. I used to wake up at like 6 a.m. with my mom calling, going, "Have you been to church yet?" It was a day of religion and not a day of drinking. And there are actually still plenty of pubs in Ireland, depending on what county you're in, that are closed on St. Patrick's Day. So a little bit different from the New York and American aspect. However, we have exported a lot of our celebrations back over, and Dublin does have a huge St. Patrick's Day party now.
Just thinking about the size of the parades here, Ken asks a question: why were the Irish so prevalent in the police and fire departments?
They really joined as a way to participate in government and to make sure that they were being treated fairly. It comes out of, and we do have to recognize, it does come out of Tammany Hall and kind of what we think of as the political corruption. And if you do study a lot of like New York police history, we do have the issues with the Irish corruption. They get associated very much with like the dock workers. So you might be familiar with the term the Irish mob associated with the docks. This was a way to basically gain a foothold in society. In order to be treated fairly by the law, you become the law.
Right. Just two more questions here. Marianne, our good friend Marianne, is asking, she is in the midst of genealogical searching. It seems that her Polish great-grandfather married Mary Birchfield. Does that name sound Irish or Scottish or Welsh?
I actually would have said it sounded English.
Huh.
However, what's interesting is Poland actually has a very large Irish community. So the Irish, while they did not believe in emigration of like permanent leaving, the Irish historically, going back to like the Middle Ages, were wanderers. And so you actually have the Irish wandering through Europe, creating all of these monasteries. It's part of what brings Catholicism back to parts of Europe and brings back some of the learning that had been preserved in the monasteries in Ireland. There's a tongue-in-cheek book called How the Irish Saved Civilization that, while it has a tongue-in-cheek name, actually has some good research in it. And you'll find that the Irish started a lot of these kind of universities and schools. And actually in Poland, the university now known as Pope John Paul II Roman Catholic University actually goes back to the Middle Ages, and it was started by Irish monks. And they actually have one of the largest Irish conferences, Irish history conferences in the world. And they have an Irish language department that has over 400 students that are fluent in Irish. When I went to that conference, it was like I was in the middle of Poland going, this is not what I was expecting to hear was the Irish language being spoken. So it is interesting to see, it could have been a name that, depending on where they got married, had kind of these mixed ancestry.
Right.
But it definitely doesn't sound Welsh, and it doesn't sound Scottish. It could be Anglo-Irish, meaning that they were descended from the Normans who basically remained Catholic after the Protestant Reformation. God, it's a lot of Irish history here that I'm trying to go over. So it could be Anglo-Irish, but I think it might be English.
All right, Marianne, it seems like you've got a lot of researching ahead of you there.
There is, just as a note, for those of you who are interested in doing Irish genealogy, as I said, there's a lot of people, you get stuck right around the period of the famine because so many records were lost. When the famine hit, whole towns literally started walking Ireland. And that meant they took their records with them, and where they died, the records were often buried. The other issue is in the beginning of the 20th century, many of the records were moved to Dublin for safekeeping, and there was a fire. So a lot of those records were then destroyed. But there is an Irish Genealogical Society in Dublin, and you can contact them via email. I will say if you get the chance to go over there, they tend to be a little bit better in person, but you need to make an appointment. So if any of you travel to Dublin and want to do genealogy, make sure you reach out ahead of time for an appointment.
Well, Bev Tyler just said that his wife is a member of the Long Island Irish Genealogy Group. And I can send this to everyone in the email address, in the email that I'll send tomorrow. Also, the website is ifhf.org, but I'll send that along to everyone so they can check that out.
And they are really good at helping, kind of each other with, locations and contacts, because a lot of it's just going through these very old church records, and sometimes figuring out the church and the cemeteries.
Right.
I'm lucky on my dad's side, we can actually go back to pre-Christian Ireland just because of the Protestantism to some degree. And my mom's side, there's just enough cemeteries that we can actually keep kind of track because they were buried in the same area. But again, I know plenty of people, they just kind of hit that wall of the famine. But the Long Island Irish Genealogical Society is a great organization.
Great. That wraps it up for the question part. So thank you everybody for your really thoughtful questions. Thank you, Tara, for this was a really fascinating lecture, and it's opened my eyes to a lot of, I have so many questions about so many different types of things. So I'm going to leave it there so we don't start a whole new conversation.
One thing I would just say is, the great thing about looking at Irish immigration is it's really the story of immigration in general, what the Irish went through. It's the experiences of what, the Italian kind of, immigrants went through and what later immigrants have experienced. How do you become part of American society? How do you keep identity? How do you, become, mainstreamed?
Definitely. Yes, thank you. Just a reminder for everyone, I will send you an email tomorrow with a recording of this lecture. It is a private, unlisted recording that's just for you, so please do not share with anyone else. This is because you attended and you registered for this event tonight. So thank you again for your support. Thank you for attending. You'll get an email from me tomorrow. And just a quick follow up, if you can see on the screen behind me, this little virtual screen, I don't even know which way I'm pointing here. Our next lecture, which is our final lecture of the year, is with a good friend, Selene Castrovia. She will be presenting Benjamin Talmadge, Unsung Hero of the American Revolution, and that is December 7th, Monday, December 7th. So I'll send you a link for that lecture too. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, thank you. Have a good night, stay warm, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.